The night Sylvie Harmon walked into the Aldridge Foundation gala, she told herself she was only there because her boss had gotten food poisoning and someone had to represent Callaway and Marsh Consulting before the firm lost a $2.3 million contract. She told herself that, twice. What she hadn't told herself, what she'd been carefully not thinking about for the past 3 weeks, was that Owen Prescott would be there. Owen, who had stood in their shared kitchen 14 months ago, looked her directly in the eyes and said the words that still crawled under her skin at 2 a.m. when the apartment was too quiet. "You'd be perfect, Sylvie. You'd be everything I ever wanted if you just weren't so much." He hadn't even said the word. He'd been too polished for that. Owen was always polished. $1,400 suits, dental commercial smile, the kind of jaw that made women forgive things they shouldn't. He'd said so much and let her fill in the blank herself, which was somehow worse than if he'd just come out with it. She'd filled it in plenty of times since then. The venue was the kind of place that made regular people feel like they'd wandered into the wrong movie. Vaulted ceilings, actual chandeliers, marble floors that reflected the candlelight back up in warm gold pools. The Aldridge Foundation raised money for children's literacy programs, which meant the city's wealthiest residents got to feel charitable while drinking champagne that cost more than Sylvie's monthly grocery budget. She smoothed the fabric of her dress, navy blue, structured with a neckline that her friend Tamsin had spent 45 minutes convincing her was appropriate and not too much. "Stop second-guessing yourself," Tamsin had said, pinning a strand of Sylvie's dark hair back from her face. "You look like someone who knows exactly who she is." Sylvie hadn't felt like that in 14 months. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She needed her head clear tonight, needed to find Howard Vance from Aldridge and talk contract renewal before someone else swooped in, and began threading her way through the crowd. That was when she heard it, his laugh first. Owen's laugh was the kind that filled a room without trying, warm and easy, and designed to make everyone nearby feel like they'd just been invited into something exclusive. She'd loved that laugh once. She'd spent 8 months thinking it was one of the best sounds in the world. She turned not because she wanted to, but because her body had apparently not gotten the memo that Owen Prescott was dead to her. He was standing near the bar with 2 other men in suits, holding a Scotch glass, looking exactly like he always looked, effortlessly, infuriatingly at ease. And beside him, laughing at something he'd just said, was a woman in a red dress. Thin, blonde, wearing the kind of effortless that Sylvie had spent years understanding she was not allowed to claim. Owen's eyes found her across the room. The worst part wasn't that he saw her. The worst part was the half-second delay before recognition hit, that brief, frozen moment where he looked at her the way you look at something you don't quite expect to see in this context, like spotting a piece of furniture you donated in someone else's house. Then his face rearranged itself into something pleasant and unreadable, and he lifted his chin in the small nod that meant, "I see you and I've decided this is fine." Sylvie looked away first. She hated that she looked away first. She found a pillar near the edge of the room and put her back to it, scanning for Howard Vance's distinctive silver hair, trying to breathe through the tight band that had wrapped itself around her chest. This was the job. She was here for the job. Owen Prescott was a footnote, a lesson, a closed chapter in a book she'd stopped reading. "You'd be perfect if you just weren't so much." She pressed her fingertips against her water glass until they went white. "You look like someone calculating how long they have to stay before it's acceptable to leave." The voice came from her left, low, unhurried, with the kind of quiet that somehow cut through the ambient noise of 200 people being wealthy at each other. She turned. The man standing beside her pillar was not, she registered immediately, someone she recognized, which was strange, because he had the particular quality of someone who should be recognized, not from television or politics, but from the way space seemed to subtly reorganize itself around him. He was tall, dark-haired, with a face that was more interesting than handsome, the kind of face that had been shaped by something more complicated than good genetics. A thin scar ran along his jaw, barely visible. His suit was charcoal and clearly custom, but he wore it the way some men wore old jackets, like it was simply a thing he'd put on, not a statement. He was looking at her the way very few people looked at her, directly. Without the micro-calculations she'd learned to spot, the brief inventory, the slight adjustment of expression, the unconscious recalibration. Just, directly. "I'm giving it 40 more minutes," Sylvie said, because something about the directness made lying feel like extra work. "I need to find a man named Howard Vance before then, or my firm loses a contract, and I have to explain to my boss why I let it happen while he was busy being food poisoned." Something moved in the man's expression. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "Howard Vance had to step out 20 minutes ago," he said. "His wife called, something about their youngest and a trampoline. He'll be back." Sylvie blinked. "You know him?" "He sits on the foundation board. I funded the East Wing expansion 2 years ago." He said it the way other people said I caught the earlier train, like it was simply a logistical fact, not a thing designed to impress. "Roman Hale." He extended a hand. She took it. His grip was firm and brief and entirely focused. "Sylvie Harmon, Callaway and Marsh, the consulting firm." He nodded slightly. "You restructured the Delacourt Group's non-profit arm last year, saved them about $4 million in operational costs." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I was one of their investors. I paid attention." A pause. "You're good at your work." Sylvie was not accustomed to being told this by strangers at galas. She was accustomed to being told she was very thorough or surprisingly sharp, with the slight upward inflection that meant for someone like you, she didn't quite know what to do with straightforward. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Roman Hale's eyes moved across the room briefly, then came back to her. "The man near the bar," he said. "The one who's been watching you for the past 3 minutes. You know him." It wasn't a question. Sylvie didn't turn around. "My ex, he ended it?" "He did." She considered him for a moment, this stranger with the quiet voice and the scar on his jaw and the disconcerting habit of asking exactly what he wanted to know. "He said I was too much," she said, which was the polished version of something less polished. Roman Hale looked at her, really looked at her. Not the quick assessment, not the catalogue, but something slower and more deliberate, like he was reading something he wanted to understand rather than skim. "He's an idiot," he said, not with heat, with the calm certainty of someone stating a known fact. Sylvie almost laughed. It surprised her, the laugh and the almost. Most people try to be more diplomatic about it. Most people waste a lot of time being diplomatic about things that don't deserve it. Before she could respond to that, she felt it. The particular quality of attention that meant someone was walking toward her with intention. She knew without turning. She'd spent 8 months learning the rhythm of those footsteps. Sylvie. Owen's voice was warm. It was always warm. That was his gift. Warmth that felt like sunlight and functioned like camouflage. She turned. He was closer than she'd expected, the woman in the red dress no longer at his side. His smile was the one she'd once thought meant something. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said. "You look—" A half-second pause, the kind she'd learned to read. Well, not beautiful, not wonderful." The careful language of a man who had made his position clear and was now performing graciousness. "Howard Vance. Contract renewal. Smart." He nodded, then seemed to register Roman standing beside her. Something moved behind his eyes. A quick recalibration. Owen was good at reading rooms, good at identifying weight. "Owen Prescott," he said, extending his hand toward Roman with the easy confidence of a man who expected to be received warmly. Roman looked at the hand for a moment that lasted exactly 1 beat longer than comfortable. Then he shook it. "Roman Hale." Owen blinked. A small thing, barely visible. Roman Hale was apparently a name that meant something to him. "I didn't realize you two knew each other," Owen said, his eyes moving between them with a new and careful interest. "We were just getting acquainted," Roman said. His voice was pleasant, his eyes were not particularly warm. "Sylvie was telling me about the contract she's here to secure. Impressive work. Owen's smile stayed in place. She's always been brilliant at her work, said with the proprietary ease of a man who believed he was being generous. Sylvie felt the familiar twist of it, the way he could make a compliment land like a consolation prize. Always? Roman's tone was mild. You say that like you have significant experience with her brilliance. Owen paused. A micro-pause, the kind most people would miss. We were together for almost a year, and you ended it. Roman glanced at Sylvie, then back to Owen, with the expression of a man working through a small and confusing math problem, and you ended it because she was too much. He let that sit in the air a moment. I'm trying to understand the logic of that, Prescott. I genuinely am. The color that moved into Owen's face was slight but unmistakable. I don't think I said. She said it. I'm choosing to believe her account over whatever version you'd prefer to present. Roman picked up a glass from a passing tray with the ease of a man for whom this conversation was mildly interesting rather than uncomfortable. You left someone exceptional because she didn't fit a particular image. And then you came over here, I assume, to remind her that you've noticed she exists, which suggests you've thought about it since, which means you already know you were wrong. A beat. Or you haven't thought about it, in which case you're simply not very interesting. Either way, I don't think there's anything useful for you here. The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. To Sylvie, it felt like a season. Owen looked at her. Some complicated thing moved through his expression, something that might have been regret, or embarrassment, or both. I hope work goes well, he said, and his voice had lost some of its warmth. He walked away. Sylvie waited until he was out of earshot. Then she turned to Roman Hale. No, he agreed. He's going to think that you've moved on and are doing fine? Roman's mouth curved slightly. Good. She looked at him for a long moment. You're a strange man, Mr. Hale. Roman. He turned to face her more fully. And yes, I've been told. Howard Vance returned 23 minutes later, slightly harried, with the expression of a man who had talked his youngest child off an emotional ledge via speakerphone while driving. Sylphie'd secured the contract renewal in 11 minutes. She'd done her homework, knew the numbers cold, knew exactly where Calloway and Marsh had delivered and where they'd exceeded projection. Roman watched from across the room. She noticed. She wasn't sure how she felt about being noticed, but she noticed that she'd noticed, which was its own kind of data. When she finished with Vance and turned back toward the room, Roman was waiting with the same quality of patience he seemed to bring to everything. Contract, he said, renewed. She allowed herself a small smile and expanded. Of course it was. He said it like it was the only logical outcome. You keep saying things like that. Like what? Like the good thing was the expected thing? Like you already knew how it would go? Roman considered this. I read people reasonably well, he said, and I've seen your firm's work. The combination made the prediction easy. He paused. Would you like to get out of here? There's a bar 2 blocks north that's quieter, and I'd rather have this conversation without 200 people performing philanthropy around us. Sylvie looked at him. She thought about all the reasons this was a strange idea. This man she'd met 40 minutes ago, this city, this night that had already bent in unexpected directions. I don't know anything about you, she said. You know I fund children's literacy programs. I keep track of good consulting work, and I find your ex-boyfriend's logic baffling. A slight pause. That's a reasonable start. She put her glass down on a passing tray. 2 blocks north, 2 blocks north. The bar was called Larkin's, and it was exactly what he'd said. Quiet, warm-lit, with the smell of old wood and good bourbon, and something vaguely like cedar. They took a corner table, and a woman who appeared to know Roman by name brought drinks without being asked. You come here often enough to have a usual order, Sylvie observed. It's a good place to think. He settled back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who had stopped performing comfort a long time ago and simply had it. What is it that you actually want to know? Sylvie wrapped both hands around her glass. Where did the foundation money come from? Private equity, originally, then commercial real estate. Then several things I'm better at explaining on a whiteboard. His eyes were steady on her. I'm 41. I've built 3 companies from nothing and sold 2 of them. The third I kept because I want to. A pause. I grew up in Bridgeport. If that matters to you, which kind of person it makes me, it should. It did matter to her. She didn't say that yet. The scar on your jaw, she said instead. He touched it briefly, reflexively, the first self-conscious gesture she'd seen from him. Bar fight when I was 22. The man I was fighting deserved it. So did I, honestly. Something shifted in his expression. I've done things I'm not proud of. I don't hide that. What I am now is not the same thing as what I was then, but it came from the same person. Sylvie was quiet for a moment. That's a remarkably honest answer for a first conversation. I find dishonesty expensive. He tilted his head slightly. You've been careful tonight. The way you carry yourself, it's not insecurity, it's armor. You built it well. She felt something tighten in her chest. Most people can't tell the difference. Most people aren't paying attention. The night moved on, without them noticing. They talked about the Delacourt restructuring, and she explained the logic behind 3 decisions that most of her colleagues had questioned at the time. He followed every thread, asked the right questions, pushed back in exactly 2 places where she knew, honestly, that she'd made slightly conservative calls. No one pushed back on her in exactly the right places. It was rarer than diamonds. They talked about Bridgeport and what it felt like to be the first in a room where everyone else had been first for generations. They talked about the moment you realize that the standard someone else set for you has nothing to do with your actual dimensions. She told him carefully about what had happened with Owen, not just the ending, but the slow, careful way the ending had been built. The small adjustments, the compliments that curved, the year of being subtly told that she was a lot, and that a lot was a problem to be managed rather than a landscape to be moved through freely. Roman listened the way he did everything, completely. When he said it, Sylvie said, turning her glass slowly on the table. When he said too much, I spent weeks trying to figure out which part to reduce, like it was a specific thing I could locate and fix. She shook her head. It took me a while to realize he wasn't identifying a problem. He was telling me about his own limits. Roman was quiet for a moment. What did you figure out after the while? That I don't want to be smaller. She said it simply. The way you say things that have taken a long time to become true. I want to take up exactly the space I take up. I want someone who doesn't see that as a problem to solve. Roman Hale looked at her across the table in the warm, low light of a quiet bar, with an expression that was not pity and was not performance. You take up the right amount of space, he said. For the record. She looked at him for a long moment. You're very certain of things for someone I met 90 minutes ago. I'm certain of the things I've had time to observe. I've been watching you work a room, handle your ex with more grace than he deserved, and hold your own in a conversation I was genuinely interested in having. A slight pause. That's enough data. Sylvie laughed. A real one, not the careful social laugh she'd been deploying all night. It caught her off guard, the realness of it. Roman's expression shifted, softened slightly. In a way you should do that more, he said quietly. What? That. The city outside was its usual midnight version of itself, all moving lights and weather that couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. They stood on the sidewalk outside Larkin's, and Sylvie could feel the particular quality of a night that had become something other than what it started as. I need to ask you something, she said, and I want an honest answer, all right? Tonight, back at the gala, when you said those things to Owen, she looked at him directly. Was that about me? Or was that about the way men like him operate, and I was adjacent to it? Roman was quiet for a moment. Not because he was assembling an answer, she thought, but because he was deciding how much of a true one to give. Both, he said finally. Men like Prescott. I've watched them work my whole life. They build people down so they feel larger by comparison. It makes me genuinely tired. He paused. And also, yes, you specifically. I didn't like watching it happen to you specifically. Why specifically? His jaw shifted slightly. Because in the first 3 minutes of talking to you, I could tell that whatever he'd done had settled on you wrong, and you were carrying it anyway. And I didn't like it. Sylvie held his gaze. That's a lot to observe in 3 minutes. I told you. I pay attention. A cab moved past them, its light cutting briefly across the wet street. Sylvie breathed in cold air and the smell of rain that hadn't quite arrived yet. I'd like to see you again, Roman said. Straightforward, the way he did everything. No performance. No management. If you want that. She stopped. Started again. I'm not someone who's easy to. I'm not looking for easy, he said. I'm looking for real. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. You're real, Sylvie. She stood with that for a moment, let it land without deflecting it, which was harder than it sounded. Same time next week, she said. Here, you can tell me about the third company you kept. Something moved in Roman's face that she'd remember for a long time, not a smile, exactly, but the fullest version of the architecture of one. Same time next week. Owen Prescott left the Aldridge Gala at 11:15, slightly ahead of schedule, in a mood he would have described to anyone who asked as fine. He knew Roman Hale by reputation. Everyone in a certain radius of finance and development knew Roman Hale by reputation. He was not, Owen thought, pulling on his coat in the parking structure, the kind of man who did things without reason. And the reason Roman Hale had stood in that corner with Sylvie Harmon, the reason he'd looked at Owen the way you look at a small problem you've already solved, was not incidental. Owen had a lot of time in the weeks that followed to think about the look on her face when she'd laughed at something Roman said. He had thought, when they were together, that he knew all of Sylvie's laughs. It turned out he didn't know that one. He'd been too busy asking her to be smaller to notice what she looked like at full size. The message came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the gala. Sylvie was at her desk with a coffee that had gone cold, reviewing a proposal for a non-profit the firm had just taken on. Aldridge reached out. They want to discuss a separate initiative, youth workforce development, full scope. I mentioned Callaway and Marsh. You should expect a call this week. She read it twice. Then she put the phone down, picked it up again, and typed, You didn't have to do that. The reply came in 40 seconds. I mentioned you because you're the right person for it. That's all. See you Saturday. See you Saturday. She smiled at her phone in her empty office, in the morning light, in the particular quiet of a day that was shaping up to be better than it had started. Sylvie Harmon had spent 14 months trying to locate the part of herself that was too much. She had turned herself over like a puzzle piece, examined every edge, tried to file things hands down to fit a shape that someone else had decided was the right one. She had not found the part to remove. She had found, eventually, that the question had been wrong from the beginning. She was, as it turned out, exactly the right amount. And there was someone in this city, quietly certain, paying attention, asking no one to be smaller, who had known that within 3 minutes of meeting her. Some people, she thought, taking a sip of cold coffee and pulling up the proposal again, were worth being full-sized for.